Hey, what's up, YouTube? It's Eric Carter-Landin, the host and producer of True Consequences podcast, and I'm here to talk to you about the Torreon cabin murders. Don't forget to hit the subscribe and like button and the bell to get notifications when new videos are out. Okay, let's get started. What does justice look like to you? Is it holding people accountable, getting the whole story, or is it making sure that people go to jail and stay there? For me, justice looks like holding people accountable for their harmful actions and making sure that people who are dangerous go to jail and stay there so they can't hurt others. Those are givens. But I want to add that justice also looks like fairness to all of those accused. It looks like the ones who deserve to be in prison are the ones who go to prison. With no bias or prejudice, justice is supposed to be about balancing the scales. The Torreon cabin murders are considered the most heinous crime in New Mexico. Please be advised, this story contains accounts of child death. I am Eric Carter-Landin, and this is True Consequences. The 18th Street Gang originated near 18th Street and Union Avenue in the Rampart district of Los Angeles. It was one of the first multiracial and multi-ethnic gangs in Los Angeles. They rose from second-generation Hispanics, but soon opened their membership up to Central Americans. As these members were deported, the members would recruit in their home countries of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The bitter rivalry between the MS-13 members and the 18th Street members in those countries led to the highest murder rates in Central America. The 18th Street Gang is recognized by the ATF as one of the most violent street gangs in the United States. In 1993, there were 155 street gangs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Gang membership was estimated at about 6,000 to 7,000 people in this city alone, and that number has risen significantly over the years. While real numbers may never be known, currently there are approximately 246 gangs with upwards of 8,000 members in Albuquerque alone. The 18th Street Gang is known for ranking in children as young as 11 years old. Most of their members spend their entire lives in gang culture. This tragic case begins with 3 members of the 18th Street Gang on August 9, 1995, when Sean Wilkins, Benaniah Jr., and Sean Popelski carjacked someone in Albuquerque and took that car on a joyride to Winslow, Arizona. 3 days later, the boys were arrested on I-40 in Winslow for possession of a stolen vehicle. Sean Popelski tells police that his name is Frank Gomez. Now, the problem with that is this is the same alias used by another gang member named Joseph Espinoza. The boys spent a few days in jail and were released since the car had been recovered and there was no damage done to it. They were supposed to return to Winslow for sentencing the next month. On September 15th of the same year, Sean Popelski was found asleep in another stolen vehicle in the Northeast Heights neighborhood of Albuquerque. He again gave the name Frank Gomez and told the police that a boy named Dominic stole the vehicle and that he was just along for the ride. Dominic was arrested and Sean was set free. The 18th Street Gang had very strict rules when it came to loyalty to the gang and its members. It's one of the most structured gangs in existence. Members will often be ranked out if they violate the rules. Sean Popelski was skating on thin ice with that gang for a while, but he ended up violating 2 cardinal rules 3 times in 1 month. The first violation was when he used the name Frank Gomez, knowing that it was another member's alias. He did this several times, and the second was when he gave the police Dominic's name as the guy who stole a car in the Heights. These were his final strikes. On November 15, 1995, arrest warrants were issued out of Arizona for the auto theft charge. The boys had missed their court date. One of the arrest warrants was for Frank Gomez. Joseph Espinosa was arrested for the auto theft in Winslow because he had often used the same alias when he was arrested on another charge in Albuquerque. So now Joseph Espinosa was facing charges for auto theft in Winslow, but he was never even part of that crime. On November 30th, Bonita, who was a female gang member, threw a party so that Sean Popelski could be ranked out of the gang. Essentially, ranking out is when a member is no longer a part of the gang. Usually this consists of gang members beating the member to be ranked out for several minutes. The beating is timed and typically lasts about 3 minutes. Bonita called Ben Jr. to tell him that there was going to be a party at her house that night. Sean Popelski had been staying with Ben and his father since his mother had kicked him out of the house earlier that year. Ben told Bonita that he probably shouldn't come to the party since Sean was with him and he couldn't leave him alone at the house. Sean had a propensity for stealing. Sean overheard the call and told Ben that they might as well go to the party and get the beating over with. He knew he was being ranked out, and he couldn't avoid it forever. So Ben went to the party. When they got there, Sean was met at the door by Sean Wilkins. Wilkins threw the first punch, hitting Popelski in the eye. The rest of the members at the party joined in beating Popelski up with bats and other weapons, and then they kicked him and punched him. The beating lasted the traditional 3 minutes. When it was over, Popelski was bleeding from several wounds. He had broken ribs, head wounds, and other lacerations. Ben Jr. didn't participate in the beating, but he didn't do anything to stop it either. He liked Sean, but he wouldn't violate gang rules for him. Besides that, Sean was wearing thin on Ben's patience. He had been living off of Ben for several months, and he didn't appreciate that Sean wouldn't even offer to pay his own way. Ben's girlfriend, Cassandra, had been supporting herself, Ben, her 2 kids, Johnny and Matthew, and Sean with her food stamps for months. And Ben's dad, Ben Sr., had been giving Sean a place to stay. Neither Ben Jr. nor Sean had jobs, so they didn't really have any means to support themselves. While Ben Sr. didn't mind giving the boys a place to stay, since he was trying to get them both out of the gang life, Ben Jr. was over it and was ready to cut ties with Sean. Sean knew that he was wearing his welcome thin. Since he had been ranked out of the gang, Ben Jr. would have no loyalty to him anymore and no reason to put him up. But he had nowhere else to go. So he planned to keep hanging around until something else came up or he was thrown out. He didn't really try finding a solution to his problem, he just refused to leave. And Ben Jr. wasn't confrontational enough to make him leave. So they were at a stalemate. Ben Sr. allowed Ben Jr. to borrow his Jeep one day. He also allowed Ben Jr., Cassandra, and the kids to use his cabin in Torreon. Torreon's about a 50-mile drive from Albuquerque, and at that time there wasn't very much between Albuquerque and Torreon. Ben Jr. was planning to go up there and stay indefinitely with Cassandra and the kids so that he could dodge the charges against him in Winslow for the stolen car. Ben Sr. made it very clear that no one else was to drive the Jeep, and he really didn't want Sean at the cabin. The cabin was not meant to be a place to live. It was meant as a place to spend the weekend. You see, some might go as far as describing the cabin as rustic, and that might be a generous description. The cabin itself was a small structure that had a kitchen, a living room, and 2 bedrooms. There was a bathroom, but the cabin had no running water. A 50-gallon drum was the only water supply, so water was very limited. The cabin was built airtight so that it would stay warm in the winter, but heat was supplied by space heaters. The cabin was fairly secure. Usually it was only used by the family in the summer, so Ben Sr. made sure that there were security locks on the windows and doors, and the property was fenced and even had locks on the gates. Having 5 people in that cabin for an extended period could be challenging, especially when 2 of those people are 3 and 4 years old. The situation was not ideal, but Ben Jr. insisted this was the way things were going to go, and Cassandra followed along. Of course, Sean wasn't going anywhere unless his cash cow finally threw him out. On December 10th, Ben Sr. drove up to the cabin with food and drinks for Ben Jr., Cassandra, and the children. He was a bit surprised to see Sean Popelski still hanging around, but he didn't say anything. He also brought a new deadbolt for the front door and a wax ring for the toilet. Ben Sr. and Ben Jr. went to fix the toilet while Sean offered to fix the lock on the door. Sean put one set of keys on the keyring to the Jeep. He pocketed the other set of keys. The lock on the door is keyed on both sides, both the inside and the outside, so a key is needed to open the door from either side if the deadbolt is engaged. December 10th, 1995 was the last day that Ben Jr., Cassandra, and the children were seen alive. Ben Sr. had planned a trip to Las Vegas, Nevada. He left on the 15th of December. He came back the next week to find that his house had been broken into and some money and guns were stolen. He found the keys to the cabin in one of his jacket pockets, so he thought that Ben Jr. had come to return the keys. He hadn't heard from Ben Jr. since he had gone to the cabin to fix the toilet, but that wasn't really unusual. The Jeep wasn't at the house, so he thought that Ben Jr., Cassandra, and the kids had found another place to stay. They were probably tired of not being able to take a shower or go to the bathroom inside. Cassandra's mother's house was also broken into that day. A VCR and a few other small items were taken. The odd thing was that a bag of her grandson's clothes were left on the porch. On April 8, 1996, Profi Cedillo reported her daughter Cassandra and her grandsons missing. She hadn't heard from them or seen them since December. On April 14th, Ben Sr. went to the cabin. The roads had cleared by that time, so it was easier to get his car up the dirt road leading to the cabin. He had been getting unusually high electric bills for the cabin, and he wanted to find out why. He thought that maybe there was an electrical problem. When he got there, he found that the gate was unlocked and that there was trash all over the property. His first thought was that squatters had gotten in, but when he went inside, he saw that a couch had been tipped over and lit on fire. And then he went into one of the bedrooms and found the bodies of his son and Cassandra. He immediately called the police and the cabin became a crime scene. State police arrived, but very little evidence was taken. The house had been wiped of fingerprints, so the only prints they found were those of the children. Several space heaters had been left on, which caused the high electric bill. It was discovered that Ben Jr., age 17, Cassandra Cedillo, 23, had both been shot in the head. Cassandra's children, Johnny Ray Garcia, age 4, and Matthew Jean Garcia, age 3, were locked in the cabin alone. They eventually starved to death. Agents Michael Fenner and Frank Jacoby were originally assigned to the case. Agent Fenner had been with the New Mexico State Police for 11 years prior to the murders, but he had never investigated a homicide. Agent Jacoby had been a patrol officer for 3 years prior to the murders. He was assigned to narcotics in the end of June 1995, and he had not investigated a homicide in his career prior to this. Eventually, Officer Juan De Reyes would join this team. Officer De Reyes was with the Albuquerque gang unit, and he was called in since Ben Jr. had known gang ties. He, like Agent Jacoby and Agent Fenner, never investigated a homicide, but he would later boast that he knew how to handle a, quote, gangland killing. At this time, New Mexico was cutting back on costs, so they didn't bring an evidence technician to the scene to collect anything. Pictures were taken, and the cabin was dusted for fingerprints, but nothing was taken out of the cabin or processed. It's important to remember that DNA was available in 1995. Juan De Reyes took the lead on the case, and it made sense at the time since this could have been gang-related. De Reyes began by interviewing all of Ben Jr.'s known associates. He found Frank Gomez, who's really Sean Popelski, in the jail on a burglary charge. De Reyes brought Agent Jacoby with him. The interview was never recorded. Most interviews were not recorded, and those that were recorded don't have proper introductions and often start in the middle of the interview. Popelski denied having anything to do with the murders. He told De Reyes that he didn't know who would. Officers asked him if he knew any of Ben's other associates, and Popelski told them Roy Buchner and Sean Wilkins were very close to Ben. Officers also interviewed Popelski's girlfriend, Ari. She told them that Sean was angry at Ben because Ben didn't jump in to defend him when he was being ranked out of the 18th Street Gang. Cassandra's mother and brother were interviewed. Cassandra's mother, Profi, told investigators about the break-in at her house and the clothes that were left behind. But other than not having seen Cassandra or the boys for months, she really didn't know anything. Jeremy Cedillo, Cassandra's brother, told investigators that he was with Sean Popelski around the middle of December. He, Popelski, and Little Dreamer were trying to sell guns to Green Eyes. These are all gang members. Popelski was trying to sell a .22 caliber rifle, which happens to be the same caliber that was used to shoot Ben Jr. and Cassandra. Many other members of 18th Street were interviewed. All of them told investigators that Popelski was trying to sell a .22 caliber rifle sometime around the middle of December. Bonita, the woman who hosted the ranking out party at her apartment, told them about Sean's ranking out, and she also told police that Ben Jr. had told her that he didn't want Sean hanging around anymore because he was, quote, a leech. On April 17th, Juan De Reyes interviewed Frank Gomez for the second time. Police still didn't know he was actually Sean Popelski. Again, Sean denied any involvement with the shootings. He told officers that he'd been in jail, so he couldn't know anything about it. They also interviewed Lawrence Nieto. He told the story of Popelski trying to sell guns to Green Eyes. Officers tried to track down Green Eyes, but they never found him. When he was pressed about the murders, he asked for a lawyer. But De Reyes continued to question him. He asked for a lawyer several times during this exchange, but he was ignored every time. On April 19th, Juan De Reyes and Michael Jacoby went back to talk with Frank Gomez. They wouldn't find out that Frank Gomez was Sean Popelski until they came back on the 23rd to interview him for the fourth time. It was during this interview that Sean Wilkins' name was dropped again. Juan De Reyes knew Sean Wilkins. Wilkins had a reputation for violence. In fact, De Reyes had to move his family out of a house in the North Valley because there was a drive-by at his house. De Reyes suspected that Sean Wilkins was the shooter. He thought that probably Roy Buckner was the driver. He couldn't prove it, but the scenario with Ben Jr., Cassandra, and the boys might be a way to get Wilkins and Buckner convicted of something. Did De Reyes concoct a story, and did the desire to close the case for Jacoby and Fenner cause them to go along with this story? Is it possible that the three of them began to feed their narrative to Sean Popelski? Is it possible that they knew that Popelski had killed Ben and Cassandra and left the kids to die, but instead wanted to pin it on Wilkins because of the drive-by at his house? Popelski had been trying to cover his tracks for months. So when he was given the opportunity to blame somebody else for his actions, he took it. And honestly, who wouldn't? The police were really trying to find other corroborating witnesses. And it seemed like Lawrence Nieto might be the easiest one to convince since he only had an IQ of 68. Here's the story that was created out of this whole thing. Essentially, it was said that Popelski, Ben Jr., Cassandra, and the kids were at the cabin and they decided to have a party. They allegedly invited Nieto, Wilkins, and Buckner showed up to do drugs and drink. Buckner, Wilkins, and Nieto showed up in a stolen Camaro or maybe a Trans Am. They really couldn't tell which since it was dark and the car was parked down the hill. But Popelski knew it was maroon. They had come to kill Popelski for being a snitch. At some point during the party, Nieto, Buckner, and Wilkins went back down to the Trans Am, went back down to the car that was parked down the hill, and they put on white masks, came back up to the cabin. When they got to the cabin, Popelski was outside peeing. Wilkins approached Popelski and said, "Face down or underground." Popelski laid face down. Then Nieto showed up and he took Wilkins' place. Nieto put a foot on Popelski's back and told him he wouldn't kill him as long as he laid still. At that point, Popelski said he heard 8 or 9 shots inside the cabin. He said that this happened sometime in the middle of December. Dates were a moving target for these guys, sometime between the 15th and the 18th. That would put Popelski with Little Dreamer selling guns, so he really couldn't have been at the cabin when this happened. According to the story, Nieto told Popelski to keep lying still. Then Buckner and Wilkins came out of the cabin with drugs and guns, and Nieto, Buckner, and Wilkins ran down to the car and drove away. According to Popelski, Buckner locked the door behind him. Popelski doesn't mention Buckner being at the cabin until 4 days after Buckner was arrested for the murders. Before implicating Buckner, Wilkins had locked the door. Popelski doesn't mention Buckner being at the cabin until 4 days after Buckner was arrested for the murders. Popelski then got into the Jeep and started chasing the others down. So, like I said, Popelski claimed that Wilkins locked the door. He also claimed that he got into the Jeep and started chasing the others down. He told investigators that the keys to the Jeep were already in it, which would mean that the keys to the cabin were also in the Jeep. If the deadbolt was locked and the keys were with Popelski, how did the door get locked? Really, that question was never answered in any of the interviews. Popelski continued his story by saying that he wanted revenge for what Nieto, Buckner, and Wilkins had done to Ben Jr. but the Jeep stalled out at the bottom of the hill and he lost sight of the car. He then said that he drove to Albuquerque and cruised around everywhere that he knew the others would hang out. He never found them. Yet the story was a little different. He said that he didn't want to go to the cabin at night. He said he wanted to stay home with his family, but Buckner and Wilkins made him go. Nieto, Buckner, and Wilkins drove to the cabin in a stolen primer black Camaro and they parked down the hill. There was no party going on and Popelski wasn't even there. When Nieto went outside to pee, Buckner and Wilkins walked back down to the car and put on black masks and gloves. Then they came back. According to Nieto, he had to pee a lot because he was still doing his business when he heard 4 or 5 shots coming from inside the cabin. He went into the cabin and saw Ben Jr. dead on the floor just inside the door. Wilkins put a gun to Nieto's head and told him that he better keep his mouth shut. They grabbed the guns and drugs and left. He said that Buckner locked the door. He said that they burned the masks and gloves at a rest stop on their way back to Albuquerque. Nieto's version of this story took place sometime in January. And before anyone was arrested, Popelski and Nieto were interviewed several times. Most of the tapes either started in the middle of the interview with no introduction, or the interviews weren't taped at all. None of the suspects were ever Mirandized on record. The police took no evidence from the cabin. They depended completely on the testimonies of eyewitnesses. Sean Wilkins was arrested for the murders on May 11, 1996. Roy Buckner was arrested on May 13th, and Lawrence Nieto was arrested on May 15th. Popelski was set free on probation for his last burglary and for his escape from jail. His probation officers were Frank Jacoby and Michael Finner. Popelski was supposed to check in with Jacoby and Finner every week, but he never checked in with them. He committed several crimes while he was on probation. He was arrested during this time and was released into Jacoby and Finner's custody again. It wasn't until Maurice Moya became an investigator for Roy Buckner's defense team, that a real timeline came to light. He went back to the cabin and found that none of the trash had been collected from the cabin for DNA. And since the cabin had been released as a crime scene, the yard had been cleaned up. The cabin itself was never cleaned up. And Moya had somewhat of a crime scene to work with. He studied the fires, collected the paint cans and space heaters, and he tried to take fingerprints, but the house, of course, was white. When Moya had the evidence he needed, he began to recreate the fires. He brought in experts to help him. One of the experts was a retired police chief who went to the cabin with Moya and explained how and why the fires were set. There were at least 3 fires set on 3 separate occasions, which were meant to cover up the murders. A couple weird things though. There was no sign of forced entry. The first fire was set to the couch, probably the night that Cassandra and Ben were killed. Later, someone came back and started a delayed fire with paint cans and a candle. This fire only scorched a wall. The last fire was set with paint cans and space heaters. That one scorched up the floor in the bedroom where the boys were found. None of these fires were successful, because when Ben Sr. built the cabin, he made sure it would hold heat, and he made it airtight. And as you probably know, if there's no oxygen, a fire will not last. Moya also tried to get his hands on the tapes of the interviews. Oddly, they weren't in the evidence locker at the police station. They were being stored at the DA's office, and the DA refused to give the interview tapes to the defense. Moya also revised the timeline of the murders so he could pin down a date. He found that Cassandra used her EBT card in Albuquerque at 11:44 p.m. on December 1st. She spent $140 on food that night. On December 3rd, 1995, Ben Jr. was pulled over driving his dad's Jeep. In the report, Cassandra, Popelski, and Popelski's girlfriend Ari were reported as being in the Jeep with Ben Jr., but there's no mention of the children being in the Jeep that night. Ben Jr. told police that they were all on their way to the cabin in Torreon. The next day, December 4th, Roy Buckner was arrested. He was released the following day, and then again on December 5th, Cassandra's EBT card was used in Albuquerque, and Ben Jr. dropped Ari off at her house. December 6th through 12th, Sean Wilkins was arrested on a burglary charge. He was placed into custody at the Bernalillo County Jail. On December 8th, Cassandra's EBT card was used again in Albuquerque. On December 10th, Ben Sr. went to the cabin to bring food for the kids. He He also fixed the toilet while Sean Popelski fixed the deadbolt on the door. According to Maurice Moya's timeline, the murders had to take place sometime between December 11th and December 15th. The first fire was set at the cabin immediately after Ben Jr. and Cassandra were shot to death. We're going to take a quick break. And we're back. On December 11th, Roy Buchner spent the entire day working. Then he went to the DMV with his grandfather. It was confirmed by his coworkers that Roy worked every day that week. Many nights, he didn't leave until 7 p.m. or later. Between December 12th and December 17th, Lawrence Nieto was in Juarez with his friends. He stayed with these friends after coming back from Juarez until December 22nd. Popelski was known to be selling guns with Little Dreamer and Jerry Cedillo to Green Eyes on December 15th. Popelski stayed with Little Dreamer until December 22nd. At this time, Popelski was driving Ben Sr.'s Jeep. This was also around the time that Ben Sr.'s house was broken into and the keys were left in his coat pocket. It was also the time that Porfi Cedillo's house was broken into and the boys' clothes were left on the porch. On December 17th, Popelski and Little Dreamer left in the Jeep. They headed to Pecos, Texas to visit one of Little Dreamer's relatives. The Jeep broke down in Pecos on the 20th of December, and Little Dreamer's aunt sent Little Dreamer and Popelski money so they could stay at the Holiday Inn that night. She also gave them money to catch the bus back to Albuquerque the next day. Popelski stayed the night at Little Dreamer's when they got back to Pecos on the 22nd. The Jeep was left in the parking lot at the Holiday Inn in Pecos, Texas. On Christmas Day, Popelski was arrested for breaking into a car wash coin machine. He had been booked into jail in Belen, New Mexico. On March 23, 1996, Popelski escaped from jail with, quote, the two Daniels, who had stolen a car and went to the cabin where Popelski attempted to set another fire. This time, he used the space heaters and paint cans for a delay. A neighbor heard loud music coming from the cabin. Later, she would tell Maurice Moya that she was sure of the date because there was a comet that night, so she went outside to see it. She remembered hearing music coming from Anaya's cabin and thinking that she was glad someone was having a good time. On March 24th, Popelski was arrested in Albuquerque for possession of a stolen vehicle. He used the name Frank Gomez again. The bodies were discovered in the cabin on April 14th by Ben Sr. The first time that Lawrence Nieto was interviewed, he was in jail for an unrelated charge. During all his interviews, he asked for a lawyer several times. And during most of these interviews, some of which were never recorded, the officers involved just talked right over him and didn't acknowledge his request at all. They did the same thing to Sean Wilkins and Roy Buchner. During one of Sean Wilkins' interviews, De Reyes accused him of the drive-by at his home in the North Valley. He told Sean that it was Sean's fault that he had to move. The arrest of Wilkins and Buchner was particularly unjust. They were taken to the Santa Fe prison and put in cell block 6, which is known for violence. It's an isolation block, and Juan De Reyes made sure that everyone knew why Wilkins and Buchner were there. According to reports, De Reyes made sure that he would be the one who escorted Wilkins and Buchner to their cells when they were arrested. As he was walking with them down the cell block, people reported that he was yelling, "Make way for the baby killers." The prisoners on cell block 6 did not have a television, they would not have been allowed books or radios, and they had nothing to keep their minds occupied. They were single housed in 6x12 cells. They were allowed out of their cells for 1 hour a day, and they got to shower every other day. They were allowed one phone call a week, which could only last 15 minutes. Since it was well known that Wilkins and Buchner were suspected of being the murderers at the cabin in Torreon, the other inmates as well as the guards had put hits out on them. So they refused to leave their cells for fear that they would be killed if they did leave. There was a mail slot in the door so they could get their food. The guards would sling the food through the slot as hard as they could, and the food would end up on the floor. Sean and Roy were forced to eat their food off the floor. They were not allowed to have cleaning supplies either. Their cells remained food-stained and filthy. They had spent 6 months like this before they even went to trial. No showers, eating food off the floor. Their lawyer said they were gray in color, and they had lost a lot of weight and were close to insanity. Both looked close to death. The day of their trial could not come quickly enough. Let's talk a little bit more about Sean Popelski. He was born in Korea. His mother was Korean and his father was American. The family moved to the US when he was 8, and up until that time he had only spoken Korean and didn't do well in school after coming to America, since he had problems learning English. His mother and father divorced shortly after moving to the States, and his father moved to Mississippi after the split. This left his mother to raise him by herself. He became incorrigible and was always in trouble. She told him to leave her home when he was 16. He had been ranked into the 18th Street Gang when he was 11 years old. It was the only life he knew, and by the time he was ranked out of the gang, he was only 18 years old. He had been jailed several times for crimes ranging from theft to assault, yet somehow he managed to only do short stints in jail every time. According to sources, after the murders, he spent several months watching the news trying to figure out if the bodies had been found. He committed several crimes in the months between the murders, and then again when the bodies were found, to, quote, create alibis. One of those crimes was breaking into a change machine at a car wash in Berlin on Christmas Day 1995. That was the one that got him locked up until he escaped in March. Lawrence Nieto was found guilty of all 4 murders in 1997. He was supposed to testify at his own trial, but when he got to the stand, he pled the 5th. Originally, he was sentenced to 440 years in prison. 7 years later, his sentence was reduced when a tape surfaced proving that Nieto had been coerced into a confession and his Miranda rights were violated. His sentence was reduced to 39 years, and through a glitch in the system, he was released in 2010. He was formally released in 2012, but that wasn't supposed to happen until 2022. In Wilkins and Buckner's trials, the state was seeking the death penalty for the murders of the children. Both Buckner and Wilkins refused plea deals that would take the death penalty off the table. They proclaimed their innocence until the very end. Sean Wilkins and Roy Buckner's trials both ended in mistrials. They were released immediately after their second mistrial when the judge dismissed the charges against them. In death penalty trials, a jury must come to a unanimous decision for the defendant to be convicted or acquitted. If acquitted, there is only one trial. The defendants are set free and they can't be retried. The jury couldn't come to unanimous agreement either way, and this happened in both of their trials. After the second trial, the judge made the decision to not try them for a third time. The mistrials are largely what led to them being persecuted after their release. Since they weren't officially acquitted, in most people's minds, they were guilty. In reality, most people believe they were guilty just because they were accused. Nieto was called as a witness during both of their trials. While he was on the stand, he retracted his entire confession and told the court that none of what he said before was true. He submitted a statement to Roy Tuhig, who was Roy and Sean's lawyer. The statement reads as follows, quote, I, Lawrence Nieto, under penalty of perjury, state that the following statements are the truth. I was the defendant in a criminal case in Torrance County, New Mexico, in which I was convicted of 4 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, and armed robbery. The conviction was upheld on appeal by the State of New Mexico Supreme Court, reported at 2000 NMSC 31, 129 NM 688, 12P, 3D 442. I presently have a state habeas corpus petition pending challenging my conviction. I have reviewed the 2 videotapes of my statements to police on May 13, 1996, as well as a transcript of the testimony I gave in the trial of Roy Buckner, and the transcript of the testimony I gave in my own trial. I am executing this affidavit at the request of Roy Tuhig, the attorney for Sean Wilkins and Roy Buckner. I am doing so of my own free will. I went to school until 9th grade. I was in special education classes. I was diagnosed with ADD. I was in YDC and the New Mexico Boys School at Springer on and off from the age of 14 until the age of 18. I've had a hard time learning things in school. I haven't done very well with reading and understanding what I read. I was questioned by police in April and then again on May 11th. Both times, I denied knowledge of the killings of Benaniah, his girlfriend, and her 2 children. I was being truthful in denying my participation and my presence at the time Benaniah and his girlfriend were killed at the cabin where their bodies were later found. On May 13, 1996, I was in police custody and interrogated for many hours. I had been picked up early that morning after being out partying all night. I was very tired and was yawning and distressed during the interviews. This is obvious on the first videotape from May 13th. Some of my interrogation was videotaped. Once I reviewed the 2 May 13th videos, which were provided by the state to Mr. Tuhig, it was obvious to me a lot more interrogation took place outside of that which was videotaped. Detective De Reyes pushed very hard for me to claim that Sean Wilkins was involved. He said that my brother and my family would be in danger. He said Wilkins is an animal and said Wilkins would kill me. They also said that if I didn't tell them what they wanted, I would be in the same cell or the cell next to Wilkins and he would kill me. De Reyes said Wilkins had done a drive-by shooting on his home and it was personal, and his family was threatened by that and had to move. He also said that he knew what happened at the cabin and that he and Agent Fenner told me a story. He showed me a report which he said had a story, which he and the other officer said Popelski had told them. I read and heard that story, and I saw Popelski and claimed that I was at the cabin and that Wilkins and Buchner were involved in the murders. I was told by De Reyes and the state police officer that the word would be let out that my brother was a snitch, and that he and my family would be killed if I didn't go along with this story. I was told that the police would talk to the DA about helping me. De Reyes and Fenner did most of the questioning and most of the threatening. They made me afraid for my family. I believed their threats, and that they would make it look like my brother was a snitch in another case so that the gang members would come after my family. I believed their threats and that they would make it look like my brother was a snitch in another case so that gang members would come after my family. I didn't think I had any choice except to go along with the story they said they knew and said Popelski had told. They went over it in detail with me and talked to me on the videotape. Then they went over it again and then talked to me on the videotape again. They put words in my mouth. They supplied the details of the story, and then when I told them something, they pressured me to change. When I told them something different, they pressured me to change it. After the first May 13th videotape part, I was taken to another room. At their request, I drew them a diagram in which I showed where the bodies were, but I was just guessing. I later learned the bodies were in the bedroom, but I had drawn them near the door. The diagram apparently disappeared. I already asked for a lawyer and they told me I didn't need one, so I was sure I had no way to get help at all. I could see it was obvious that De Reyes and Fenner were forcing me to make the same statement that Popelski had made if I wanted my family to stay alive. I also got assurances that if I did so, nothing would happen to my family, or to me. They talked about moving us away and protecting us, and even mentioned helping us live in Taos. As I started to do what they wanted and told them the details that I made up from the ones they gave me, they corrected me on the details and got me to change them. The second May 13th videotape shows me telling a story about how the murders took place, which didn't have Popelski present. I described stopping at a rest stop to burn things, and I didn't even know if there was a rest stop or not. I later learned there is no rest stop on that highway. I described Benaniah as being fully dressed when he was shot and seeing him on the floor in the bedroom. I later learned that he had been found in bed, obviously being shot in his sleep. I said this because I was trying to make things up, which would keep them from putting word out that my brother was a snitch. My brother was trying to go the right way. He'd never been to prison, but he was suspected in being involved in a gang-related murder in Westgate. He was not charged with it. Another person was charged with it, and police were threatening to make it look like my brother had informed on him. This definitely would have put my brother in a dangerous position. It was not the story they wanted. They then came up with a different story of Popelski saying that he was there and I held him at gunpoint. On May 15th, before State Police Detective Eric Lucero videotaped me for that statement, De Reyes and the other officers, including Jacoby, had come to the jail and gotten me and taken me to the State Police office in Santa Fe. They then coached me to change the story by showing me a report showing what they said Popelski told them. I went along with that because they pressured me to do so. They went over the story many times with me, so it was the way they wanted it. A lot of it changed from the second May 13th interview to the videotaped May 15th interview. I was not at or near the cabin when Benaniah was killed. I did not ride to the cabin with Wilkins and Buchner. I did not see either of them with guns. I was not held at gunpoint and did not hold Popelski at gunpoint while Wilkins and Buchner went into the cabin. I did not see Wilkins and Buchner go into the cabin. At the time that police claimed these murders took place, I was in Juarez with friends or on the way back from Juarez, possibly in Ruidoso. I didn't make this story myself. I was given to me because it was what Popelski said, and I was forced to tell this story to save the lives of my family especially my brother. And finally, because I was threatened the way I was, I could see that I had no choice other than to go along with the story which De Reyes and the state police gave me. I changed it like they wanted for the same reason. If they had not threatened me, coerced me, I would not have said that I was at the cabin, or that Buchner and Wilkins were there, or that I knew anything about the killings." End quote. Buchner and Wilkins are working and free, but they never received any mental health care after their ordeal in prison. Both suffer from PTSD. Roy Buchner rarely leaves his apartment. Sean Wilkins was arrested again in 2010 for domestic violence, assault, burglary, and child abuse. Both have had drug problems since their arrests, and both have suffered in the court of public opinion. People still believe they are guilty of the murders at the cabin. Shortly after his release, Roy Buchner went to a bar in Albuquerque to have a couple of drinks. The bartender charged him triple what the drinks cost. Buchner refused to pay the tab, and the police were called. When APD arrived, they arrested Buchner. On his way to the jail in Albuquerque, the officer yelled as loud as he could, "Make way for the baby killer." After their release, Sean and Roy sued Juan De Reyes, Frank Jacoby, and Michael Fenner for mishandling of the case. They lost the suit. Police are protected from personal lawsuits in New Mexico. Sean Popelski was charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary. The prosecution added a firearm enhancement in the deaths of Cassandra and Ben Jr. He was convicted in the deaths of the children, but was acquitted for the murders of Ben Jr. and Cassandra. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. He only served 9 years for the murders. After his release in 2008, he went on to commit several crimes in New Mexico, Nevada, and Alaska, including attempted murder in Nevada. He was extradited from Alaska to New Mexico in 2015 on an assault charge. De Reyes, Jacoby, and Fenner retired before the case went to trial. They did testify at all the trials after their respective retirements. We trust the police to investigate crimes fairly, and usually they do. But in this case, was it investigated fairly? Did they try to make the evidence fit their narrative in this case? Did they pick their suspects and make eyewitness testimony fit the crime? Justice in this case was blind and fickle. The justice system failed both the victims and the accused. In any murder case, there are more victims than just the ones who were killed. The shockwaves will radiate through entire families. Parents, siblings, grandparents, and extended families suffer the rest of their lives. And in this case, justice wasn't served for any of them. The victims' families felt cheated when Buchner and Wilkins were set free. They felt that the police had the right people in custody. They did what we all want to do. They trusted the justice system. Newspaper accounts at the time painted Nieto, Buchner, and Wilkins as guilty even after it was proven that they weren't. Journalism is not supposed to be biased. It's supposed to help the public get information, but often the truth can be buried in the news. Justice must serve everyone, or it is not just. These victims deserved justice, and so did the accused. The result of this case wasn't justice for anyone. Ben Jr., Cassandra, Johnny, and Matthew deserve better. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, New Mexico.